One tank cost the United States and West Germany over $1.5 billion in joint development funding. It featured a revolutionary gun that could theoretically destroy any Soviet armor on the planet. It was equipped with a cockpit-style interior that looked like something ripped out of a fighter jet. Engineers called it the future of armored warfare. The generals called it a generational leap. And then, in 1969, after nearly a decade of work, both nations walked away from it in complete and total humiliation. The MBT-70 was not just a failure. It was the single most expensive armored disaster in the history of the Cold War. But exactly why this billion-dollar machine collapsed so catastrophically under its own ambition, that story comes at the end of this video. What follows is the complete documented record of every American Cold War tank project that failed, was canceled, or was quietly buried before the Soviets ever had to fire a single shot at it. T28 Super Heavy Tank / T95 Gun Motor Carriage. The war in Europe had barely ended when American engineers were already drawing something monstrous. The T28, also designated the T95 Gun Motor Carriage, was born from the brutal lesson of the Siegfried Line. If the next war meant cracking open fortified Soviet positions, the Army wanted something that nothing on earth could stop. What emerged from the Aberdeen Proving Ground weighed 95 tons of rolled steel, powered by a Ford GAF engine producing 500 horsepower. The math was already brutal. That translated to barely 5 horsepower per ton. For comparison, a fully loaded freight truck performs better than that. The T28 could not exceed 8 miles per hour. It could not cross most bridges without engineering support. It was too wide for most European roads, and its single-fixed gun, a devastating 105mm T5E1, could not rotate in a turret because the tank did not have one. Commanders had to physically drive the entire vehicle to aim. 2 of these machines were built. One was destroyed in a fire during testing. The other sat forgotten in a field at Fort Belvoir for over a decade, rediscovered by accident in 1974, buried under grass and mud. The T-28 was not retired. It was simply abandoned, too heavy to move, too flawed to fix, too embarrassing to remember. M103 Heavy Tank. By 1950, the Army had a new nightmare to contend with, the IS-3. When Soviet heavy tanks rolled through Berlin at the end of World War II, their pike-nosed frontal armor and 122mm main guns had sent military analysts in Washington into a quiet panic. The answer was the M103. Weighing 62 tons and armed with a 120mm rifled gun capable of penetrating the heaviest Soviet armor at combat ranges, it looked formidable on paper. In practice, it was a maintenance officer's worst nightmare. The M103's engine, a Continental AV1790, was so difficult to access that replacing it in the field required removing the entire rear hull plate. A single engine swap took a trained crew between 8 and 12 hours under ideal workshop conditions. In the muddy, frozen forward areas of West Germany, that timeline stretched into days. The gun itself held only 38 rounds of ammunition, and its loading mechanism was so complex that sustained fire was nearly impossible without crew exhaustion setting in. The Marine Corps eventually took delivery of 220 units and used them until 1973, largely because they had no alternative. The Army phased them out as quickly as possible, grateful that no one had ever actually needed to rely on them in combat. T-30 Heavy Tank. Before the M103 came the T-30, a transitional heavy tank from the immediate post-war years that never found its moment. Armed with a massive 155mm gun, it carried only 34 rounds and required a semi-automatic rammer just to load each shell, because the round was too large and heavy for a single crew member to handle unaided. The gun was so powerful, it could theoretically destroy any vehicle on Earth at the time of its development. But by the time the T-30 reached serious evaluation, the entire concept of the super heavy tank had already begun to collapse under its own logic. Nuclear doctrine was rewriting the battlefield. If a tactical nuclear weapon could erase an entire armored division in seconds, What was the strategic purpose of a 70-ton machine that could barely cross a river? The T-30 was canceled in 1948, a relic before it ever fired a shot in anger. T-34 Heavy Tank, the American one. Not to be confused with the legendary Soviet machine that bore the same designation, America's T-34 was a heavy tank prototype mounting a 120mm gun on a T-29 chassis. It was part of the immediate post-war effort to field a credible counter to the heaviest Soviet armor. Testing began in 1948. The results were deeply mixed. The gun itself was exceptional, but the vehicle's fire control systems were rudimentary, the crew ergonomics were poor, and logistical support for a tank this size was effectively non-existent in the lean post-war army. 4 prototypes were built, none entered service. The program was absorbed into the broader lessons that eventually produced the M103, itself a problematic machine, as already documented. The American T-34 represents a familiar pattern in Cold War armor development, enormous firepower mounted onto a platform that the military and industrial infrastructure of the era simply could not support. M551 Sheridan. It was supposed to be revolutionary. The M551 Sheridan was designed to do something no American armored vehicle had ever managed: be light enough to be dropped from a cargo aircraft by parachute, yet carry a weapon powerful enough to destroy a main battle tank. The solution was the 152mm M81 gun launcher, a weapon that could fire either conventional ammunition or the M51 Sheridan anti-tank guided missile from the same barrel. In theory, the Sheridan could land behind enemy lines, fire a missile that could kill a T-54 at 2 kilometers, and then disappear before the Soviets knew what hit them. In practice, the combustible cartridge cases used for the conventional rounds were violently unstable. In Vietnam, multiple Sheridans were destroyed by their own ammunition cooking off when enemy RPG rounds struck the hull. The casings were made of a material similar to nitrocellulose, the same compound used in smokeless powder. Any penetrating hit turned the fighting compartment into an incinerator within milliseconds. Crews began to dread their own vehicles. The Sheridan missile system performed poorly in rain, dust, and smoke. In other words, in virtually every real combat environment. The guidance wire was fragile. The electronics were temperamental. In training exercises in Germany, units reported that the missile missed its intended target during a significant portion of live fire evaluations. The Sheridan was used in Panama in 1989 and Desert Storm in 1991, primarily because nothing else was light enough to deploy rapidly with the 82nd Airborne. Retired in 1996, it left behind a legacy that was more cautionary tale than battlefield triumph. MBT-70/KPZ-70. This is the disaster that was promised at the beginning of this video. In 1963, the United States and West Germany launched one of the most ambitious armored vehicle programs in the history of either nation. The MBT-70, or KPZ-70 in German service, was intended to be the definitive main battle tank of the NATO alliance, a machine so advanced it would make the Soviet T-64 obsolete before it even entered full production. The specifications read like science fiction. A 152mm gun launcher identical in concept to the Sheridans, capable of firing the Sheridan missile system. A hull that could be lowered hydraulically, allowing the tank to crouch behind terrain and expose only its turret. An engine delivering 1,500 horsepower, extraordinary for the era. A fire control system that automatically corrected for crosswind, ammunition type, and barrel wear. The driver was placed inside the turret itself in a gyroscopically stabilized capsule, meaning the crew compartment rotated independently of the turret's outer surface. It sounded breathtaking. It was an absolute engineering catastrophe. The gyroscopically stabilized driver's capsule regularly malfunctioned, leaving the driver disoriented and the hatch unable to open properly during emergencies. The hydraulic suspension system was maintenance-intensive beyond any reasonable field standard. The missile guidance system, inherited from the Sheridan program and its well-documented failures, performed just as poorly in an MBT-70 as it did in a 20-ton airborne tank. The Germans and Americans disagreed fundamentally on virtually every major design decision: the choice of engine, the caliber of armament, the language of the technical manuals, and the workshare split between factories. By 1969, West Germany had withdrawn from the program entirely. By 1971, the United States Congress terminated its funding. Total expenditure, approximately $1.5 billion in 1970s money. 0 tanks entered operational service. XM-803. After the MBT-70 collapsed, the Army attempted to salvage something from the wreckage. The XM-803 was a simplified, cheaper version of the MBT-70 concept, stripped of its most extreme and expensive features. The driver's rotating capsule was removed, the hydraulic suspension was scaled back, the per-unit cost was reduced, but the fundamental problems had not been solved. They had merely been made slightly less catastrophic. Congress reviewed the XM-803 program in 1971 and reached a simple conclusion. The vehicle was still too expensive, still technically immature, and still failed to offer decisive advantages over existing designs. The program was canceled the same year it was seriously evaluated. Its only lasting contribution was to make the case, urgently and expensively, for an entirely new approach, a program that would eventually become the M1 Abrams. T-92 light tank. In the late 1950s, American engineers attempted to build the perfect airborne light tank. The T-92 was the result, a compact, well-designed vehicle mounting a 76mm gun in an unusually low-profile hull. At under 20 tons, it was genuinely impressive for its era. Its silhouette was so low that it measured barely 1.5 meters to the top of the hull. The driver lay almost completely prone inside. The turret overhung the rear of the vehicle in a configuration that seemed innovative and aggressive. Testing revealed serious problems with the auto-loading mechanism, unreliable at speed over rough terrain. The Army was also in the midst of reconsidering the entire light tank category, uncertain whether a vehicle this lightly protected could survive a Cold War battlefield, increasingly saturated with anti-tank missiles and artillery. The T-92 was canceled in 1960. Its hull design, however, influenced several subsequent development programs: T-54E1 and the oscillating turret experiment. During the early 1950s, the U.S. Army became briefly fascinated with the French oscillating turret concept, a design where the entire upper turret section tilted rather than using a traditional breech mechanism. The T-54E1 mounted this system on a modified M48 chassis as an evaluation platform. The promise was a faster rate of fire and a simpler loading mechanism. The reality was a turret that accumulated toxic gun gases in the fighting compartment when the gun fired at high angles of elevation, and a system that was far more mechanically complex than the traditional design it sought to replace. The project was quietly shelved. The Americans returned to conventional turret designs and never revisited the oscillating configuration for a production vehicle. ORSV, Armored Reconnaissance Scout Vehicle. By the early 1970s, the Army needed a replacement for the aging M114 reconnaissance vehicle, a vehicle so universally despised by its crews that it had been pulled from service in Vietnam after operators refused to stake their lives on its performance in heavy jungle terrain. The ARSV program evaluated multiple competing designs through most of the decade. None of the candidates could satisfy all requirements simultaneously: low weight, high speed, amphibious capability, armor protection against 14.5mm heavy machine gun fire, and sufficient firepower to engage enemy scouts. The program drifted through budget cycles, changed specifications repeatedly, and ultimately produced nothing. Reconnaissance units were eventually equipped with the M3 Bradley, a far heavier and more expensive solution than anything the ARSV program had envisioned. T-249 Vigilante. The Korean War had taught the Army a brutal lesson about the vulnerability of ground columns to close air attack. The T-249. Vigilante was the proposed solution, a self-propelled anti-aircraft system mounting a 6-barrel, 37mm Vulcan-type rotary cannon on a modified M113 chassis. The weapon itself was genuinely lethal against low-flying aircraft. During testing, the rotary cannon's rate of fire was so extreme that it consumed its entire ammunition supply in seconds of sustained fire. The logistical implications of a vehicle that emptied itself in under 10 seconds of actual use were severe enough to kill the program. Ammunition resupply in a fast-moving air defense environment was impossible. The T-249 was canceled in 1963. Every tank on this list represents billions of dollars, thousands of engineering hours, and the frustrated ambitions of men who genuinely believed they were building the future. Some of them were right. The MBT-70's composite armor research flowed directly into the M1 Abrams. The Sheridan's missile gun combination, despite its spectacular failures, proved that gun-launched missiles were technically possible, even if tactically unreliable. The T-92 established design principles for low-profile turrets that would be revisited decades later. Failure in armored vehicle development is never truly wasted, but it is always expensive. And in the Cold War, with Soviet armor deploying in numbers that dwarfed American production capacity, the price of each canceled program was measured not only in dollars, but in the soldiers who would have had to fight the next war in whatever imperfect machine eventually survived the budget hearings. The M1 Abrams, that ultimately emerged from the ruins of the MBT-70 disaster, became one of the most successful main battle tanks ever built. That story, however, is for another video. What these canceled machines prove, definitively, is that the most dangerous battlefield of the Cold War was not in the Fulda Gap. It was in the design bureaus, the congressional hearing rooms, and the proving grounds of the United States Army, where ambition and reality collided with a force that no amount of armor could absorb.